Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we drift quietly through time to the fading light of an empire that once ruled the world. The Roman Empire did not vanish overnight. It dimmed slowly, like the last glow of embers after a long fire. As you listen, you may feel your breathing slow, your thoughts grow still, and the soft sound of the fire behind this voice wrapping you in calm. Before we begin, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Whether it's a quiet midnight or the first hour of dawn, you are welcome here. Together, we'll wander through the long dusk of Rome, not in war or chaos, but in stillness. The empire at twilight begins with silence. The once busy roads are quieter now. The marble statues of emperors stare into the distance, their features worn smooth by wind and rain. The world around them has not ended, only slowed. 1,000 small changes, each unnoticed, have begun to weave the fabric of decline. In every province, from the deserts of Africa to the misty forests of the north, life continues, but differently. The taxes come later, the roads crack, the governors change too quickly. Farmers plant their seeds, merchants open their stalls, and soldiers stand guard. Yet a subtle weariness fills the air. Once, the empire was full of ambition, building, conquering, dreaming. But now, the energy that built Rome seems to have drifted elsewhere, leaving behind an echo of greatness. The people sense it, though they cannot name it. They speak of harder winters, thinner bread, quieter streets. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the sound of it. Not collapse, but fatigue. Empires do not truly fall in one moment. They sigh, they slow, they loosen their grip on time. Rome was vast, too vast perhaps, and its heartbeat stretched across continents. In that stretching came strain. Even the mighty city of Rome itself felt it. The marketplaces were still alive with trade, but the crowds grew smaller. The baths were open, the theaters lit, yet the laughter echoed more than it once did. The city was still beautiful, but in the way of something remembering its own golden days. Far from the capital, along the edges of the empire, soldiers stood guard over lands they no longer understood. To the north, where people Rome called outsiders, strong, restless, and watching. To the south and east, the old trade routes carried fewer goods. The world was shifting, quietly, beneath their sandals, and in the midst of all this, the ordinary people, the potter, the shepherd, the scribe, lived their days, as always. They rose with the sun, worked, rested, and dreamed. They may not have known that they were living in what historians would one day call the decline. To them, life was simply life. If you close your eyes, you might picture it, the warm glow of lamps flickering on stone walls, the scent of olive oil and dust, the distant hum of voices as another Roman evening settled in. A great empire still stood, yet its twilight had already begun. As night falls across the empire, small fires glow in courtyards and inns. The sound of quiet talk, of metal cups on wood, carries through the cool air. For generations, Rome's people believed their world would always endure. Now, though they do not say it aloud, many feel the change, the subtle unease of something great beginning to fade. The empire's borders still stretch far, but the soldiers who guard them are fewer, their pay uncertain. Commanders write reports that no one reads, waiting for orders that never arrive. Yet, in the soft light of dawn, they still stand at their posts, not for glory, but for duty, for habit, for the rhythm of the day. In the cities, coins have lost their shine. Markets that once overflowed with silks and spices now offer simpler wares, clay, grain, rough cloth, wealth has not vanished. It has simply grown tired of moving. The pulse of trade beats slower, like the heart of an old traveler resting on the roadside. The Senate still meets, though its words carry less weight. The emperors still issue decrees, though fewer obey. Rome still calls itself eternal, but even the stones seem to whisper otherwise. The strength that once built roads, aqueducts, and armies now bends under its own memory, and yet the beauty remains. The columns rise against the sky, the mosaics still shimmer in candlelight. Children still play in courtyards, chasing each other over cracked marble tiles. To them, the empire is simply the world, vast, normal, unchanging. History moves slowly for those living inside it. Sometimes, a traveler arriving from the frontier brings news of battles, of shifting tribes, of strange faces beyond the river. The city listens, but only half believes. How could such distant whispers touch them here, in the heart of all civilization? But history rarely asks permission before it arrives. As the years pass, Rome's leaders come and go like shadows. Some try to restore the old glory. Others simply hope to hold things together a little longer. None can stop the quiet decline. It is not the fault of one man or one war. It is the weight of centuries, pressing softly, steadily downward. Still, there is calm in this twilight. The streets glow under torchlight. The Tiber River drifts beneath its bridges, and the moonlight settles on the domes and roofs. The empire is still alive, not as it once was, but enough to breathe, enough to dream a little longer. And perhaps that is how great things end, not in thunder, but in silence. In the slow dimming of the day, in the hush between what was and what will come next. Rome, for all its pride and power, began to rest. So tonight, as the embers glow and the world outside grows quiet, let that image stay with you, an empire at peace with its own fading light. The stones, the roads, the walls, all waiting for dawn, patient beneath the stars. You are safe to drift now. Let history whisper you to sleep, and we will continue our journey through the falling empire in the next chapter. This story is meant to be gentle, a slow tide of words, steady and calm, like the soft breathing of a world that once ruled everything it could see. Rome's greatness came at a price. Every victory, every marble column, every shining road carried a hidden weight. The empire had stretched itself across mountains, deserts, and seas, a vast and beautiful body that needed endless care just to keep standing. In the beginning, expansion felt like destiny. Each new province brought wealth, gold, and glory. But after centuries of conquest, the empire's appetite began to tire. It owned too much land, too many cities, too many promises to keep. Imagine the network of roads, tens of thousands of miles carved into stone, connecting Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria. Every road demanded maintenance. Every garrison needed supplies. Every soldier expected pay. It was a miracle of human organization, and a constant drain. In faraway provinces, officials wrote letters begging for funds. Bridges collapsed, walls crumbled, and carts grew scarce. Sometimes, taxes arrived too late to matter. Other times, they arrived too often, leaving farmers with little to survive on. The machine of empire had grown too large to oil. There's a strange stillness to such moments in history. The power remains, but the energy fades. It's like watching a torch burn low, the flames still bright, but the wax nearly gone. Rome, for all its glory, was beginning to run out of breath. In the capital, Senators still debated and poets still recited, but fewer people listened. The empire was busy keeping itself alive, not growing, not dreaming, just maintaining. Maintenance can be noble, but it rarely inspires songs. Armies, once driven by ambition, now marched out of duty. Many soldiers were no longer born Roman, but drawn from lands the empire had conquered. They fought bravely, but not always for Rome itself. Loyalty was stretched thin, just like the frontiers they guarded. Even the sea, once Rome's safest road, began to grow uncertain. Pirates returned, storms disrupted trade, and ports fell silent for whole seasons. The empire's arteries, its trade routes, began to clot. For the average Roman, life was still bearable. Markets opened, crops were sown, and children played in courtyards. Yet under the surface, something subtle shifted. The empire was spending more to earn less, building more to maintain what was already there. It's a quiet kind of exhaustion, the kind you don't notice until it's too late. Rome wasn't falling apart. It was simply wearing out. Its reach was too long, its appetite too great, and its energy too human to last forever. Sometimes, emperors tried to fix things. They raised taxes, reorganized armies, redrew borders. For a while, it worked. Then the strain returned. It always did. Repairing the empire was like mending a roof in a storm. As soon as one leak was patched, another opened. In the provinces, governors began to rule more like kings. They built their own palaces, commanded their own troops, and sent fewer taxes home. Loyalty to the empire still existed, but it had to compete with loyalty to survival. For merchants, the vastness of Rome became both a blessing and a curse. The roads brought opportunity, but also risk. A single band of raiders could end a fortune. A single bad harvest could ruin a region. The empire's size magnified every problem, and so the people adapted. They learned to trade locally, to rely less on the distant capital. What had once been one great empire was slowly turning into a collection of smaller worlds, each living under the same banner, but drifting apart like islands in fog. There's a strange beauty in this decline. The empire still glowed with the color of its past statues polished by time, walls standing against centuries of wind. Yet the heart of it all beat slower, steadier, softer. If you were standing in Rome at dusk, you might not notice the difference. The streets still hummed with life. But listen closely, and you'd hear fewer songs, fewer celebrations. A tired city still pretending to be eternal. The cost of too much isn't sudden. It creeps in quietly, through tired hands, through thinning silver, through promises that grow harder to keep. Rome's greatest strength became its greatest weight, and still, the empire endured. Because endurance is what Rome did best. Even when it stumbled, even when it could no longer grow, it held on, stubborn, proud, and unwilling to fade. That too is a kind of greatness. The empire's wealth was once its pride. Golden coins stamped with the faces of emperors. Treasures flowing in from every province. Grain ships crossing the seas like drifting fortresses. Yet even gold can lose its shine. When too much wealth passes through to few hands, the system begins to tremble. The cities demanded more walls, more marble, more entertainment, while the countryside quietly emptied. Farmers left their fields for work in towns, and the soil that once fed Rome grew quiet. What began as abundance turned into imbalance. Gold moved, but food did not. Trade glittered, but hunger lingered. And slowly, the people who had built the empire began to feel that they were serving something that no longer served them. Taxes grew higher, but the roads carried fewer goods. Armies were still paid, but sometimes in promises instead of silver. Merchants began to hoard, fearing that their coins might lose value before the next sunrise. Inflation whispered through markets like a rumor. A loaf of bread cost more each week, and the weight of copper in a coin meant less and less. Trust, once Rome's invisible currency, became fragile. When money loses meaning, people turn to barter, to favor, to silence. The empire's wealth still looked magnificent, but underneath the gold, it was hollowing out, like wood eaten by quiet insects in the dark. In distant provinces, the signs of strain became harder to hide. The once loyal governors began to act with growing independence. They raised local taxes, kept local soldiers, and stored the grain that should have gone to Rome. For them, the empire was no longer a shared duty, it was a distant idea, fading across the horizon. Messengers took weeks to arrive, carrying orders that were already outdated. In the absence of strong communication, every region began to breathe its own rhythm. Rome's strength had always been unity. Now, its weakness was distance. What once connected the empire, its vastness, now pulled it apart. The roads that had once been Rome's greatest invention turned against it. Built to move armies swiftly, they now carried trouble with the same speed. Rebellions, raids, and rumors traveled faster than ever before. Where once Rome could send help in days, now it took weeks. And even when soldiers arrived, they found that loyalty was not what it used to be. Some fought for Rome, others for whoever could pay them first. The empire that had taught the world order was now learning the quiet chaos of overreach. Too much land, too many needs, too few hearts left to believe in the same cause. In the capital, the signs were subtle but constant. The marble buildings still gleamed in the sunlight, but the repairs grew sloppy. The mosaics faded, and fountains ran dry for weeks. The Senate still met in grand halls, but debates grew shorter, voices weaker. The empire was still rich in image, but images can't hold up the weight of a world. The citizens of Rome still felt proud to call themselves Roman, but pride is a heavy thing when the streets around you begin to crumble. Even greatness, when stretched thin enough, starts to sound like an echo. Yet for all its fatigue, the empire did not surrender. It adapted, it adjusted taxes, shuffled legions, and tried new systems of trade. One emperor after another promised renewal. Some truly believed it possible, and for a time, the empire even seemed to recover. The roads were repaired, coins reminted, and the grain ships sailed again. Hope flickered like a candle in the wind, bright enough to be seen, fragile enough to vanish. Rome had not fallen yet. It was learning, painfully, how to survive on less. The human story behind it all was one of quiet resilience. Families continued their routines, baking bread, weaving cloth, raising children. Markets opened each morning, as if the empire were eternal. But behind each transaction was fatigue. People spoke in lower tones, moved a little slower, trusted a little less. The decline of a civilization is not a sudden sound, it's a long exhale. The air grows heavier, the rhythm slower. Rome was still breathing, but it was the breath of endurance, not expansion. The emperors, wrapped in fine robes and guarded by soldiers, still believed they could fix it. They issued reforms, new coins, new rules. But reforms mean little when the people no longer believe. The empire had grown so vast that even its rulers could not see its edges. And so, they ruled by habit, repeating the motions of power without its pulse. The empire's machinery turned, but without direction. It was only motion for motion's sake. If one could walk through the empire then, from one border to another, it would feel like walking through time itself, different centuries coexisting side by side. In one village, Roman order remained strong. In another, local chiefs already ruled. The empire had become uneven, patchwork, like an old quilt kept for comfort, even as its threads began to fray. And yet, that quilt still warmed millions of lives, proof that even a weary empire can give shelter, if only for a while. At night, the taverns and courtyards still echoed with stories of emperors long gone, of victories that once seemed endless. People spoke softly of what Rome used to be, and sometimes of what it might become again. But deep down, they knew. History moves forward even when no one is watching. The empire had reached its limit, not in strength, but in balance. Too much of everything, and not enough to hold it together. When dawn broke over the 7 hills, the sun still lit the city in gold. But gold, as always, only shines on the surface. Beneath the rooftops, the people went about their day, carrying the quiet weight of an empire that was still alive, but slowly slipping into history. The cost of too much is never paid all at once. It's paid in generations, in patience, in the steady hum of lives lived between greatness and its memory. The fire burns low now. You might hear its soft crackle, or imagine it flickering against stone walls as this story lingers. Rome, in its vastness, had begun to bend under its own weight, not broken yet, but bowed. The twilight deepens, and in the next quiet chapter, we will follow those who guarded its edges, the weary soldiers at the farthest borders, where the wind carried the first whispers of change. Soft pause, the night deepens. The fire crackles softly. Rest here for a moment, and when you're ready, we'll walk together through the fading frontiers in the next segment. Tonight, we follow the Roman Empire to its edges, the long, restless frontiers where wind and silence meet stone walls and worn-out shields. Beyond these borders lay the unknown, and within them the tired pulse of a world trying to hold itself together. Let your breathing slow as we walk these fading boundaries together. The sound of the fire remains behind us, steady and soft, like a friend who doesn't need to speak. The Roman borders were once lines of pride, drawn by victory, guarded by confidence. Massive walls, wooden forts, and long chains of watchtowers stretched from the rivers of Europe to the sands of North Africa. But walls, no matter how tall, cannot stop time. Each year brought new storms, new migrations, new people who watched Rome's borders and wondered why they should stay on the other side. Along the northern frontier, the Rhine and Danube rivers glittered under cold skies. They were more than barriers. They were living lines, trade routes, lifelines, and sometimes graveyards. Roman soldiers built bridges to cross them, and sometimes burned those bridges behind them. The rivers whispered of both safety and fear. To the Romans, they marked where civilization ended and uncertainty began. The soldiers who guarded those frontiers lived in rhythms of quiet repetition. Dawn inspections, cold meals, endless patrols. The winters were long and sharp, the summers short and humid. They watched the mist rise from forests they did not know, from lands that belonged to tribes whose names they struggled to pronounce. In that daily monotony, the empire's edges began to feel less like victory and more like isolation. Beyond the border, vast forests moved with unseen life, families, hunters, wanderers. These were not faceless enemies, but people searching for land, warmth, and safety. Some came to trade, offering fur and amber for salt and iron. Others came to settle, asking only for a corner of Roman land to farm. The Romans allowed some in, others they turned away. But mercy and caution are hard to balance forever. One season of bad harvests could turn traders into raiders. One unjust governor could turn allies into enemies. The empire's frontiers were not walls of stone, but lines drawn in trust, and trust, like an old bridge, weakens when left uncared for. Slowly, the lands beyond Rome began to shift, forming waves of migration that pressed gently, then urgently, against the edges of empire. In one frontier fort after another, rumors began to replace orders. Messages from the capital arrived late, sometimes months after they were sent. Generals argued about what to do. Should they open the gates to the refugees fleeing from other tribes farther east, or close them and risk being overrun? The empire's command chain was fraying, stretched across too much distance, too many decisions. For centuries, Rome had been the center of the world, but on its borders, the world looked different. The farmers along the Danube didn't think of marble temples or grand speeches. They thought of frost, of taxes, of raiders. To them, Rome was not an empire. It was a faraway idea, spoken in letters sealed with wax, written by hands that had never touched their soil. Yet still, they held on. Forts stood their ground. Legion banners fluttered in the wind. Each tower burned its signal fire when danger appeared, a chain of light stretching for hundreds of miles. It was beautiful, in a way, this coordination, this human attempt to hold back the tide of change. But even light cannot shine forever without fuel. The strain showed most in the soldiers themselves. Many were no longer born in Rome or even in Italy. They were sons of the frontier, men who spoke Latin as a second language, who had never seen the city they fought for. Their loyalty was to their unit, to their brothers in arms, not always to the distant emperor whose face appeared on coins. Yet they fought because fighting was life, and life was all they knew. Trade still flowed, but less freely. Caravans that once crossed the Rhine with goods now crossed with people seeking shelter. Families walked beside wagons carrying everything they owned, grain sacks, tools, small carved figures for luck. They came not as conquerors, but as survivors. To the soldiers at the border, the difference became hard to see. Crowds moved like rivers, and no wall could truly stop a river. The empire tried diplomacy. Treaties were signed, land granted, alliances formed. Some tribes became allies, sworn to guard parts of the border in exchange for peace. For a while, it worked. The Roman world grew more diverse, its people more mixed. But even peace has a cost. Each treaty was a compromise, and every compromise chipped away at the old order. Inside the forts, life went on. The soldiers drilled, repaired their armor, wrote letters home that might never be delivered. At night, the fires flickered against the stone, and the wind carried distant sounds, the rustle of forests, the murmur of languages not their own. The empire's heartbeat still reached them, faint but present, like a distant drum echoing through fog. When attacks came, they came suddenly. Small raids at first, stolen cattle, broken walls, quick retreats. Then larger ones, faster, harder to repel. Rome sent reinforcements, but they arrived too late. The frontier, once a shield, began to bend. The generals called it pressure, the farmers called it fear. History would call it the beginning of something new. Yet even under pressure, Rome did not collapse. It adjusted, as it always had. New forts were built, closer to the heartlands. Old ones were abandoned. Borders shifted southward like a tide receding from the shore. Every step backward was denied in official letters, but everyone along the frontier knew the truth. The empire was shrinking, slowly, with dignity, as if pretending not to notice. Still, there were nights when hope flickered. When the northern lights shimmered over the frozen rivers, some soldiers stood in silence, feeling small but strangely peaceful. The world was changing, but in that glow it felt gentle, a reminder that life continues, even when empires fade. Not all endings are violent. Some arrive like quiet snow. In the capital, far from the frontier, the reports of these pressures sounded distant, almost unreal. The senators listened politely, then returned to their banquets. The emperor promised strength, stability, order, words spoken into air too far away to matter. The empire's heart no longer heard its edges. The edges, meanwhile, were learning to live without the heart. For those who guarded the borders, survival became the only goal. The empire's ideals mattered less than the next meal, the next dry night, the next sunrise without alarm. And yet, these simple acts of endurance, lighting a torch, mending a shield, helping a stranger, became their own quiet heroism. So as you rest tonight, imagine those distant sentinels, standing under cold stars, breathing fog into the dark, listening to the quiet pulse of a world both enduring and ending. The pressure of borders is not just about war, it's about time itself, pushing, reshaping, reminding us that nothing grand remains unchanged forever. As the frontiers strained, the weight of that tension began to travel inward. Carried by messengers, merchants, and rumor, the provinces far from the border began to feel the echo, not in battle, but in shortages. Grain shipments that once arrived like clockwork came late or half empty. The prices of daily goods rose quietly, and the people whispered that the empire's edges were no longer secure. Fear rarely travels alone. It brings uncertainty with it, and uncertainty spreads faster than any army. In this silence, even the wealthiest citizens began to look over their shoulders. The empire had always relied on order, roads, laws, systems that connected faraway lives. But now, the roads carried not only trade, but refugees. Entire families wandered from borderlands toward safer lands within. They brought their language, their customs, their stories, and sometimes their sorrow. The empire absorbed them for a while. Yet every new arrival added both life and burden. Rome had built walls to keep the world out. Now, the world was quietly stepping in. Along the great rivers, commanders debated endlessly. Some wanted to close the crossings completely, to block migration and keep Rome pure and strong. Others believed that welcoming the outsiders was wiser, that peace could be built through compassion and trade. Neither side was wrong. History rarely offers easy choices, but every disagreement delayed action, and time, as always, favored change. The borders were no longer a line of control. They had become a question with too many answers. In the forts, soldiers noticed the difference first. The strangers who once camped outside the walls now lived within them. Markets formed near the gates, children played in both languages, and the air filled with smells of unfamiliar food. It wasn't invasion. It was blending, slow, natural, inevitable. Yet for those raised in the old ways, it felt like losing something invisible. The Roman identity, once so clear, began to blur like ink in rain. The empire's power had been built on predictability, the knowledge that each province served a purpose, each soldier obeyed a chain of command. But as the frontiers softened, the rhythm faltered. A commander might make his own treaty. A governor might choose loyalty to a local ally over a distant emperor. The old system still stood, but its spirit was thinning. When rules stretch too far, they bend, and when they bend long enough, they quietly break. In the capital, officials tried to make sense of the reports. They called it temporary unrest, a regional difficulty, a phase. But paper cannot hold back change. Every new report told the same story. Border posts abandoned, towns burned, new tribes settling in former Roman lands. The empire was still vast on maps, but in the minds of its people, the edges were fading away. Rome's confidence, once as firm as its marble, began to tremble like candlelight in a draught. Trade convoys that once moved under Roman banners now traveled with private guards. Merchants no longer trusted the empire to protect them. Each man paid for his own safety, built his own walls, hired his own soldiers. What had once been one unified defense became 1,000 small ones. And when unity splinters, strength becomes memory. The empire's frontiers were no longer shared responsibilities. They were burdens carried by individuals trying to survive. Still, life continued. People adapted, as people always do. New towns rose along the safer roads, smaller, humbler, but alive. Former soldiers married into local families, teaching their children both Latin and the tongue of the tribes beyond. These children would grow up between worlds, not fully Roman, not fully foreign. In them, the old empire lived on, not in conquest, but in mixture. History, it seemed, preferred blending over borders. The Romans had once believed that their culture would spread forever, that roads and language and law could tame any distance. But on the frontiers, distance was winning. A message that took weeks to reach the capital took months to bring back a reply. And in those months, lives were lived, decisions made, alliances formed. The empire could issue decrees, but by the time they arrived, the world had already moved on. For the soldiers still holding the walls, time felt heavy. Each sunrise brought uncertainty. Would the supply cart arrive? Would their pay come this month? Would the next group approaching the gates be friends or foes? They looked toward the forests and fields beyond the walls, seeing not enemies, but a future they couldn't stop. The pressure of borders was no longer about battle lines. It was about endurance. How long the human heart could stand against change. And then came the moment when the borders no longer held, not with a crash, not with fire and conquest, but with quiet acceptance. A gate opened, and people entered. A fortress abandoned, its stones taken to build homes. The empire did not shatter. It simply reshaped itself into something it could not yet recognize. The soldiers left behind did not see it as loss. They saw it as relief. The waiting was over. Inside the empire, the news of these shifts arrived softened by distance. The storytellers called it resettlement or migration. The senators called it adjustment. But the people in the countryside simply called it life. New neighbors, new faces, new trades. The world kept turning. Civilization does not fall in a day. It melts, slowly, into something new. At night, in the forts left behind, the wind passed through empty gates. Owls nested in watchtowers, grass grew over broken roads. The silence was deep, but not sad. It was the sound of history resting. For centuries, these borders had been held by fear and discipline. Now, nature had returned, rivers running free, trees reclaiming stone. Even endings can be peaceful when they arrive with patience. The empire's maps still showed the same lines. drawn confidently in ink. But the maps were lying. The borders on paper were no longer the borders in life. What had once been Rome's proud frontiers were now shifting zones of shared space, part Roman, part not, belonging to both and to neither. The empire had entered a new chapter, written in compromise instead of command. Those who once stood guard found new roles. Some became farmers, tending the same soil they once defended. Others joined the very people they had been told to fear. When identity becomes survival, the lines between us and them fade like the horizon at dusk. In that fading, something new was born, a quieter world, smaller, humbler, but human. Back in Rome, festivals still took place, and poets still wrote verses about victory. But the victories were now memories, not realities. The empire's true strength was no longer its armies or its walls. It was its ability to absorb, to adapt, to continue. Rome was learning, reluctantly, that power and peace are rarely the same thing. The pressure of borders had changed everything, not by destroying the empire, but by transforming it. The Roman world had grown so large that it could not tell where it ended. And when something no longer knows its own edges, it must become something else. This was not failure, it was evolution, the empire becoming the soil for a new age. So as the night deepens, imagine standing at that ancient edge. The river flows gently, moonlight glints off quiet water, and far away, a soldier lowers his spear for the last time. The frontier is gone, but the world remains, softer, slower, endlessly turning. The borders were never truly about land. They were about the fragile balance between holding on and letting go. Soft pause, the fire crackles faintly again. Rest here for a while. In the next chapter, we return to the heart of Rome itself, where order begins to unravel, and history exhales one long, quiet breath. Tonight, we step back inside the empire, away from the wind and rivers of the borderlands, into the cities and hearts where Rome once felt eternal. The fires still burn in the hearths, the statues still gleam in moonlight, but something invisible has begun to shift. The empire that once commanded the world now struggles to command itself. As you listen, let the sound of this story drift around you like a blanket, calm, steady, warm. The unraveling of order did not come from enemies or storms. It came from within, from fatigue, confusion, and too many voices speaking at once. The emperor's word still carried power, but it traveled slowly, twisted by the distance between ruler and ruled. In each province, decisions were made for survival, not unity. And in that quiet, practical way, the great machinery of Rome began to pull apart. Imagine the capital, grand halls, marble pillars, fountains that once sang with clear water. Senators in bright robes still gathered to debate, but their words no longer changed much. The laws they passed echoed down empty streets, heard by fewer and fewer. Rome's order had become an illusion, magnificent in sound, fragile in substance, and, like all illusions, it needed constant maintenance to keep shining. Governors across the empire began to act as kings in miniature. Some were fair, building roads and keeping peace. Others ruled by fear, their loyalty swaying with opportunity. They still sent reports to Rome, but mostly to keep appearances. The empire's unity was now a performance, convincing from afar, uncertain up close. The structure stood, but the foundation trembled with quiet cracks. In cities far from the capital, the signs were visible. Markets opened later, taxes rose higher, and justice took longer to arrive. Judges were bribed, soldiers unpaid, citizens disillusioned. Yet life went on. Humanity rarely stops for politics. People still married, traded, and prayed for gentle seasons. Civilization continued, even as its scaffolding loosened. From the outside, nothing had changed. From within, everything had. Communication, once Rome's greatest strength, now became its weakness. Messages moved by horse, by sea, by messenger who might never return. By the time an order reached a distant outpost, the problem it addressed had already evolved. The empire was living in delay, reacting to yesterday while tomorrow arrived unchecked. In a world built on control, time itself had become the greatest enemy. The army, once the symbol of discipline, mirrored the empire's confusion. Generals rose and fell like shifting tides. Some declared themselves emperor, others sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. The soldiers followed whoever could feed them, not necessarily whoever could lead them. Authority was still claimed, but it had lost its soul. What had once been duty now felt like survival, and in the homes of ordinary citizens, the change felt quieter but more personal. People locked their doors earlier. They stored food in hidden corners, kept their voices low when speaking of politics. Faith in the system was replaced by faith in the familiar, in neighbors, in family, in small circles of trust. The grand empire had become a collection of tiny, fragile worlds, each clinging to its own stability. The unraveling of order does not always roar. Sometimes it hums. The same streets that once echoed with triumphal marches now echoed with footsteps of people moving cautiously, eyes down, minds tired. Hope did not vanish. It simply retreated, waiting for calmer days that never seemed to come. The empire was not collapsing. It was fraying, thread by thread, beneath its own weight. Emperors tried to restore discipline. They passed reforms, issued edicts, punished corruption. But for every act of control, a dozen new problems arose. Like water slipping through fingers, power could no longer be held tightly. The empire's leaders began to realize what few dared to say aloud, that the vastness which once made Rome mighty was now its greatest weakness. Even the monuments seemed to sense it. Statues of emperors leaned slightly forward, their faces chipped by weather. The great amphitheaters stood half empty, the laughter inside them thinner than before. The beauty remained, but it was hollow beauty, the kind that remembers rather than celebrates. Stone can hold memory, but not momentum. In small towns, civic pride faded. Festivals that once honored victories grew modest or ceased altogether. The people no longer spoke of empire. They spoke of harvests, of weather, of family. The grand narrative of Rome was too large for daily life now. History was shrinking back into the hands of ordinary people. It had always belonged there. The city of Rome itself, still glowing in the sun's light, began to age. Buildings were patched instead of rebuilt, statues repaired with mismatched marble. The sound of construction was replaced by the sound of repair. An empire once known for creation now learned the patience of maintenance, the art of keeping things just good enough to last one more season. Power struggles in the palace grew quieter but sharper. Advisors whispered behind curtains, generals plotted in shadows, and trust was currency more valuable than gold. Everyone wanted stability, but no one agreed on how to achieve it. The empire's heart was divided by fear of losing what little control remained, fear of admitting that much had already been lost. In the countryside, some families never noticed the unraveling at all. They lived by the rhythm of the earth, planting, harvesting, resting. For them, Rome's fate was distant thunder. The soil still gave what it could, the rivers still flowed. The world beyond their fields might have been uncertain, but the seasons still obeyed their quiet cycle, by the will of the one who governs all things. The unraveling of order was not only political, it was emotional. The people who had once believed in the idea of Rome, its unity, its justice, its destiny, began to lose that faith. The dream no longer matched the reality they saw outside their windows, and when belief fades, no law can replace it. Still, in the evenings, the lamps were lit. People gathered, shared meals, told stories. Children laughed, not caring about empires or taxes. In those small moments, life triumphed quietly over decline. The empire might have been faltering, but the world within it continued to hum with human warmth. The unraveling was never total, because humanity does not vanish, it adapts. By night, the city's glow still shimmered on the river's surface. But if you listened closely, you could hear the river carrying the echoes of change, soft, patient, unstoppable. Rome had been built on strength and order. Now it would survive on memory and endurance. Even as order unraveled, the story continued, flowing quietly into the next chapter of time. As the years passed, the unraveling grew quieter, but deeper. The empire still looked whole from afar, the roads still stretched across continents, the aqueducts still carried water, and the emperor's image still shone on coins. But beneath those symbols, confidence had thinned. The empire's greatness had become a memory wrapped in routine. People followed old customs not from faith in empire, but because habit felt safer than change. The emperors came and went more quickly now. Some ruled for years, others for months. Each promised restoration, each swore to return Rome to its former strength. And for a while, hope flickered a parade, a new law, a victory announced from the balcony. But hope that depends on leadership alone burns out quickly. When the man at the top changes too often, people begin to look elsewhere for stability. The army, once Rome's greatest symbol of discipline, mirrored that uncertainty. Commanders fought one another more than they fought enemies. Provinces declared allegiance to their own generals, minting local coins, forming small kingdoms in everything but name. The empire was fracturing in spirit, long before it fractured in land. The banner of Rome still waved, but it flew over smaller skies. Inside the capital, the streets no longer sang with celebration. People spoke in murmurs, careful not to offend whichever faction held power that month. Suspicion replaced loyalty, and silence replaced debate. The Senate, once a place of fierce argument, now gathered mostly for ceremony, a shadow of its old self. Power had grown thin, stretched too far over too many ambitions. In the markets, prices shifted like the wind. A loaf of bread might double in cost by morning. Coins, once silver and gold, now shone dull with copper and tin. People weighed them in their hands, uncertain of their worth. Trust, the invisible foundation of all trade, was vanishing. And when trust fades, order fades with it. Rome's economy no longer pulsed with life. It drifted, tired and heavy, toward stillness. Corruption spread quietly, like vines over stone. Officials took bribes not out of greed, but out of necessity. When wages fell and taxes rose, survival became justification. A man who had once served Rome might now serve himself, telling no one. The empire was not filled with villains, just people trying to live within a system too large to care for them. The middle class, once Rome's backbone, began to disappear. Wealth gathered in the hands of a few, while the poor grew poorer. The grand villas outside the city gleamed with gardens and fountains. But beyond their walls lay empty fields where farmers could no longer pay their rents. The distance between the powerful and the powerless widened until even empathy could not cross it. Still, the empire endured. Because endurance is not always strength. Sometimes it is simply momentum. The wheels kept turning, the taxes kept collecting, the armies kept marching, even when no one truly believed in the purpose anymore. It was the persistence of habit, of systems too vast to stop. Rome was still moving, but directionless, like a ship without a captain, carried only by the current. In the city's poorer districts, families lived in crowded tenements, their walls cracked, their roofs leaking. Fires sometimes broke out, spreading quickly through the wooden structures. The government promised repairs, but help came late. And yet, in these dark corners, life carried on. Children played in alleys, women cooked in shared courtyards, neighbors comforted one another. When great powers fail, small kindnesses keep humanity alive. The streets that once hosted triumphal processions now hosted beggars and broken carts. Statues of emperors, once bright with polish, stood grey with dust. Even the fountains that symbolized abundance now ran dry for days. The empire's capital, once the heartbeat of the world, had become a mirror of its decline, not dead, but dreaming of its former self. Beyond the capital, entire regions began to drift into independence. Local leaders formed their own councils, their own militias. They still spoke Rome's language, still used its laws, but no longer waited for permission from the center. The empire was becoming an idea more than a government, a memory of order carried by habit, not command. In these years, art began to change too. Painters and sculptors no longer celebrated triumphs. They depicted quiet faces, humble scenes, mothers, soldiers, old men resting under trees. The glory had faded, but reflection had deepened. When empires grow tired, art becomes honest. And honesty, though quiet, endures far longer than conquest. Letters from the provinces told of unrest, peasants refusing taxes, garrisons abandoning posts, roads overtaken by travelers seeking food and shelter. The officials in Rome read these reports and sighed. They had read so many before. The empire's problems had become familiar, and familiarity can dull even the greatest danger. It was not ignorance that doomed Rome, it was fatigue. Sometimes, an emperor would rise who truly tried to fix things. He would reform the army, balance the treasury, inspire loyalty. For a moment, the empire would stand taller. But when he died, through betrayal or age, the old cracks reopened. The system no longer knew how to heal itself. It needed faith in something larger than politics, something it had long forgotten. Still, the people adapted. They grew gardens in abandoned courtyards, turned ruined walls into homes, found ways to live with less. There is quiet strength in acceptance, in understanding that decline is not the end, but a different rhythm of life. The empire was not falling apart everywhere. In some places, it was simply changing shape, adjusting to survive. In the countryside, where silence ruled, farmers continued their work under vast skies. They had no senators to impress, no emperors to obey. Their loyalty was to the land, and the land, by the will of the Almighty, remained generous enough to sustain them. While cities argued and empires stumbled, the earth continued its patient work. History often forgets those who kept the world running quietly. At night, the city's lamps burned fewer in number. Streets once alive with music and laughter now echoed with the sound of footsteps and distant carts. Yet even in the quiet there was peace. Rome had been loud for too long. Perhaps silence was its final mercy. The empire was not dying with screams, but with sighs. If you stood on one of its hills, then you could see it, the glow of the city dimming softly under the stars. The same stars that had watched the empire's rise now watched its calm descent. History is patient. It knows that even in unraveling, there is continuity. The world does not end. It transforms. And so, the empire rested, not in triumph, not in defeat, but in endurance. It was still Rome, only quieter. Its people, tired but resilient, carried on. They had learned what all civilizations eventually must, that nothing built by human hands lasts forever, but the lessons it leaves behind can outlive stone. Soft pause, the fire fades now, its glow settling into ash. You can rest here too, safe in the quiet of this long twilight. In the next chapter, we'll listen to the whispers of Rome's fading wealth, and how gold, once endless, became a memory of light in a darkening world. Tonight, we walk among the coins, the treasuries, and the glittering wealth that once defined the Roman Empire. The sound of Firelight still hums behind us, and as you listen, you may imagine the shimmer of gold, bright, heavy, and quietly fading. The story of Rome's wealth is not one of sudden loss, but of slow exhaustion. As value itself began to slip through the empire's fingers, for centuries, gold was Rome's heartbeat. From every conquered province came treasure, silver from Spain, grain from Egypt, jewels from the East. It was not just wealth, it was confidence, the proof that the empire could turn anything into prosperity. But the same gold that built its glory would one day become its burden. For when everything revolves around value, losing that value feels like losing the world. In the early days, Rome's coins were solid and pure. Each piece of gold or silver carried the weight it promised. Merchants trusted them, soldiers fought for them, citizens saved them. A Roman coin could travel from one end of the empire to the other and still mean the same thing. It was not just money, it was trust, made tangible. But as the empire's needs grew, the gold began to thin. Armies had to be paid, roads repaired, walls rebuilt. Emperors discovered that they could stretch their power by stretching their currency, mixing silver with cheaper metals, reducing weight, minting more coins than they had treasure to back. For a while, no one noticed. Then everyone did. Inflation began quietly, like a whisper in a crowded market. Prices rose a little, then a little more. A loaf of bread cost 2 coins, then 5, then 10. Soldiers demanded higher pay to match the prices, and the cycle fed itself. The people still worked, still traded, but their coins bought less with each passing year. It was as if the empire's gold had begun to dissolve. In the streets, merchants started weighing coins instead of counting them. The shine of gold no longer guaranteed value. Its sound no longer promised security. Money had lost its meaning. And when money falters, so does faith in the system that holds it. People began to barter again, grain for cloth, tools for oil, trusting one another more than the emperor's treasury. Taxes became heavier, pressing hardest on those with the least. To feed the army and maintain the bureaucracy, officials collected every coin they could find. Some families hid their savings underground. Others fled cities altogether, escaping not enemies, but tax collectors. Gold, once a symbol of progress, had become a reason for fear. In distant provinces, governors began minting their own coins, stamped with their own faces. Each claimed loyalty to Rome, but their actions said otherwise. The currency that once united the empire now divided it. Each coin told a different story, each with its own promise of worth and its own silent confession of desperation. The army, too, began to feel the shift. Pay was delayed, sometimes for months. When the coins finally arrived, they were lighter, duller, and worth half as much. Soldiers grew restless. Loyalty, once bound by honor, began to depend on payment. When the empire's gold lost weight, so did its authority. In the markets, artisans and traders adjusted. They learned to survive in chaos, accepting whatever form of payment could still buy bread. A woman selling pottery might accept wool instead of coins. A farmer might trade grain for tools. The empire had once invented complex systems of trade. Now it returned to the simplicity of necessity. Rome had built its world on the belief that wealth could hold everything together: cities, soldiers, peace itself. But as the gold thinned, that illusion faded. Wealth could buy materials, but not loyalty. It could fund armies, but not harmony. In the end, money could not fix what exhaustion had already undone. In the capital, the imperial treasury became a place of anxiety. Advisors whispered of shortages, of shipments lost at sea, of mines running dry. Emperors opened the vaults and found less each year, more dust, fewer coins. The gold that had once filled Rome's coffers now lay scattered across thousands of hands, thousands of hidden corners, impossible to gather again. The decline of wealth also changed the rhythm of the city itself. The grand banquets of earlier centuries grew fewer. The fountains that once poured endlessly began to run dry. Even the public games lost their luster. The empire had not lost its taste for beauty, only its means to afford it. Silence replaced celebration. Moderation replaced excess. And yet, there was a kind of grace in that simplicity. The empire, stripped of its glitter, revealed its human side. People began to value things that gold could not buy: warmth, family, kindness, survival. The humbler life that emerged from scarcity was fragile but real. Perhaps, without meaning to, Rome had rediscovered a quieter kind of strength. Beyond the walls, trade ships grew fewer. The great sea routes that once carried fortune and spice became emptier, dotted with smaller boats making humbler voyages. The Mediterranean, once called our sea by Rome, began to forget that name. The empire's reach was shortening, its grasp loosening, its presence fading like footprints in sand. Still, there were moments of light. When new emperors rose, they often brought a brief revival: reformed currency, reminted coins, renewed confidence. But stability built on hope alone never lasts. Each recovery was smaller, each golden age shorter, each promise thinner than the last. The empire was learning that even wealth has a lifespan. By now, the people no longer expected prosperity. They wished only for enough food, enough warmth, enough peace to rest. The dream of endless gold had become a distant legend. The Romans had once conquered the world for wealth. Now they conquered each day for survival. The measure of success had changed. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it: the last coin glinting in the light of a quiet market, passing from one weary hand to another. No fanfare, no prophecy, no ending song. Just the ordinary act of exchange in a world that had finally learned the price of excess. The empire was lighter now, in every sense, and so the weight of gold was lifted, not as triumph, but as surrender. The empire had spent centuries gathering treasure, only to discover that it could not buy time. All the gold in the world could not preserve what was built to fade. But even in loss, there was peace. The light had dimmed, yet it still warmed those who remained. As the empire's wealth dwindled, people learned to live differently. The great markets that once sparkled with silver and silk now offered simpler things: bread, oil, clay pots, woolen cloaks. What once was luxurious became ordinary, and what was ordinary became precious. The sound of coins clinking faded from the streets, replaced by voices trading, asking, offering. Rome had become a world of hands instead of wealth, human connections replacing golden guarantees. The empire's architects still built, but their work grew humbler. Instead of marble temples and grand theatres, they repaired bridges and restored crumbling walls. Stone by stone, they kept life steady, even as the empire's riches slipped away. Their work was no longer about beauty or pride, but about necessity, keeping water flowing, keeping roads passable, keeping the city alive through the rhythm of modest survival. Art, too, changed its language. Painters no longer depicted grand victories or lavish banquets. Instead, they painted families, quiet harvests, and scenes of daily life. Wealth had lost its glamour, but meaning had returned. The empire, in its fatigue, discovered a quieter art, not to glorify power, but to honor endurance. There is beauty in what remains when the gold is gone, and Rome was learning to see it. In the workshops, blacksmiths melted old coins to make tools. Gold became nails, jewelry turned into blades, and statues were recast to build what the empire now truly needed: plows, hinges, lanterns. The transformation was symbolic. Wealth had finally turned back into work. In every furnace and forge, the glow of molten metal was a sign that the empire still breathed, not through its treasury, but through its people. The wealthy elite still tried to preserve their fortunes. They built hidden vaults beneath their villas, buried chests of gold in gardens, and fled to safer provinces when times grew harsh. But treasure kept in darkness helps no one. The people left behind learned to depend less on wealth and more on one another. A loaf of bread shared between neighbors became more valuable than a gold coin sealed away in stone. As the economy weakened, so did the empire's reach. Provinces far from Rome began to live as if the capital no longer existed. Taxes stopped flowing. Trade ships turned elsewhere. The empire's name was still spoken with respect, but its power no longer reached the horizon. Rome, once the center of every map, now sat quietly at the edge of relevance, not fallen, but forgotten. And yet, amid the fading wealth, life continued with surprising peace. Without endless demands from the capital, local communities found freedom to govern themselves. Town councils, village elders, and craftsmen worked together to solve problems once decided by distant officials. The empire's weakness had made space for smaller strengths to grow humble, local, human. Some historians would later call this decline. But perhaps it was something else, an evolution of simplicity. When the gold vanished, the people rediscovered their roots. They built slower, lived closer, depended more on seasons than on coins. The empire had been rich in marble and metal. Now it was rich in resilience. The great hoards of treasure, once the pride of emperors, now sat untouched. In hidden vaults, piles of coins gathered dust, their value meaningless without trust to sustain it. Gold, after all, has no power unless people agree that it does. The empire's final lesson was simple: that wealth without unity is weight without purpose. In the eastern cities, trade still flourished, The empire's twin, the one ruled from Constantinople, carried the torch of Roman wealth a little longer. Its markets buzzed, its ships sailed, its coins still glittered with confidence. But even there, the shadow of the West's fall was felt. They had seen what gold could not prevent, and though they endured, they learned to fear abundance as much as scarcity. Meanwhile, in the western lands, the old Roman coins continued to circulate, passed from hand to hand by people who barely remembered the faces on them. A farmer might pay with a coin minted under an emperor whose name he had never heard. Time had erased authority, but not the habit of exchange. Gold was still gold, even when its empire had vanished. The roads that once carried caravans of riches were now overgrown with grass. Travelers moved more slowly, guided by stars instead of maps. Inns that once welcomed merchants became shelters for wanderers and monks. The silence of the old highways was heavy, but peaceful. The world was smaller now, and perhaps kinder. In cities that still stood, the buildings of marble began to crumble. Roof tiles fell, mosaics faded, fountains ran dry, and yet people continued to live among the ruins, drying herbs on windowsills, feeding pigeons in courtyards that emperors once crossed. The empire's wealth had turned to dust, but the ordinary rhythm of life refused to die. For a generation that grew up in this new world, the stories of endless gold sounded like myths. Children listened to their elders speak of shimmering palaces and overflowing markets and wondered if such things had ever truly existed. For them, the world had always been quiet, simple, balanced, a place where work mattered more than riches. The empire's fall was never truly about loss of land or soldiers. It was about the loss of illusion, the realization that wealth could not hold everything together. And in losing that illusion, Rome became more human, more real. Its story, once gilded, was now made of earth, of sweat, of memory. In time, the gold of Rome found its way into the hands of strangers, melted, reshaped, reimagined. Coins turned into crowns, jewelry into weapons, ornaments into offerings of new ages. The metal remained, but its meaning changed. The gold did not vanish. It simply moved, as all things in history must. And so, the empire that had once hoarded the world's treasure became its donor. From its exhaustion, others would rise, new kingdoms, new languages, new art. The wealth that once belonged to one people now belonged to many. The story of gold had come full circle, no longer a burden, but a lesson written in light and dust. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the faint ring of a coin dropped long ago, echoing through time. It is not a sound of greed or glory, but of memory, a reminder that everything gained must someday be let go. Gold, like history, shines brightest when shared. Soft pours, the embers glow faintly now. You may rest in this quiet moment between endings and beginnings. In the next story, we will journey east to where the twin empire stood against the tide, and where Rome, reborn in spirit, refused to fade into the night. Tonight, our story drifts eastward, away from the tired hills of Rome and toward the glittering waters of the Bosporus. There, between two continents, another empire stirred. While the west faded into twilight, the east still glowed with dawn. The Roman world had not died. It had simply moved its center of gravity. The shift of power was not a moment, but a migration, a quiet turning of history's wheel. When emperors looked west, they saw exhaustion. But when they looked east, they saw potential rich trade routes, fertile lands, and cities still humming with life. The decision to build a new capital was not surrender, it was strategy. By founding a city on the strait, where Europe and Asia met, the empire sought balance between two worlds. That city would be called Constantinople, a name that would carry the echo of Rome for 1,000 years. In its early days, Constantinople felt like a dream taking shape. The walls were strong, the harbors deep, and the streets wide and filled with merchants from far-off lands. Ships from the Black Sea brought grain, while caravans from the east carried silk and spices. Gold no longer flowed through Rome's crumbling markets. It now shimmered here, beneath a brighter sun. The empire's pulse had shifted, but the rhythm was familiar: trade, order, ambition, endurance. The emperors who ruled from this new seat imagined themselves not as founders, but as guardians. They believed they were preserving Rome, not replacing it. Latin remained in their decrees. The same eagles flew on their banners, and the same laws guided their courts. Yet everything felt lighter, fresher, less burdened by the weight of centuries. The East had inherited Rome's memory, but not its fatigue. The location itself was destiny. Surrounded by water on three sides, Constantinople was easy to defend and impossible to ignore. Its harbors filled with ships carrying more voices than anyone could count. Greek, Persian, Egyptian, Syrian. Cultures mingled, ideas intertwined. The city became a bridge, not just between continents, but between eras. Meanwhile, the Western Empire grew quieter. Its emperors ruled in name, but their power thinned with every sunrise. The armies once loyal to Rome now served local kings. The Senate, still seated in the old marble halls, debated shadows. Yet in Constantinople, the flame burned steadily. The empire had not vanished. It had divided its strength to survive. In the East, administrators learned from the mistakes of the past. They streamlined taxes, tightened trade laws, and invested in defenses rather than expansion. The empire no longer sought new lands. It sought endurance. Its focus turned from conquest to continuity, from ambition to preservation. The lesson of Rome's decline was being rewritten in quieter tones. The city itself gleamed with purpose. Great walls rose higher than any before them, triple-layered and crowned with watchtowers. Behind them, gardens bloomed beside libraries, and marketplaces echoed with the hum of languages from every shore. To walk through Constantinople was to feel history rearranging itself, not ending, but rediscovering balance. And yet, even here, the memory of Rome lingered like an ancestral voice. The senators who moved east brought their traditions with them: the processions, the ceremonies, the long speeches honoring an empire that now existed mostly in memory. It was both continuity and imitation, a mirror reflecting the ghost of greatness in new light. The people, however, saw no ghost. They saw opportunity. To them, the new capital was alive, breathing, full of promise. Fishermen watched the sunrise over the water and thanked the stability that allowed trade to flow. Craftsmen sold their wares in crowded markets, no longer worried about the chaos that haunted the western roads. Hope, once fragile, felt real again. The treasury filled once more. The taxes of thriving eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, replenished what the West had lost. The coins were purer, the markets busier, and the sense of order firmer. For the first time in generations, the empire's economy no longer chased the memory of its past. It was building a future. Diplomats from distant kingdoms came to see the new Rome. They marveled at its order, its wealth, its calm authority. What they did not see was how carefully that calm was maintained through constant vigilance, steady reforms, and a quiet acceptance that empire must now mean something different. Greatness, in this age, was not expansion. It was survival. Still, the shift of power created distance, not just across geography, but across hearts. The people of the Western lands began to feel abandoned. To them, the emperor was now a distant figure, speaking from a city they had never seen. The old capital's pride turned into melancholy, its marble grandeur into memory. The Roman world was splitting not through rebellion, but through neglect. In the East, the scholars flourished. They copied old manuscripts, preserved ancient science, and taught philosophy in candlelit halls. Knowledge became the empire's new treasure, safer than gold, lighter than conquest. As armies guarded the walls, scribes guarded ideas, and perhaps, in this way, Rome found a form of immortality through wisdom rather than war. Merchants prospered too, with trades stretching from the Nile to the Caspian. Constantinople became the heart of global commerce. Spices, silk, and precious stones flowed through its gates. The city glowed with prosperity, but it was a different kind of glow, built not on empire's arrogance, but on connection. The world was learning to meet, not conquer. To the soldiers stationed on the walls, it felt like a reward for centuries of endurance. They no longer stood on distant, desolate frontiers. Now they guarded a city that truly seemed worth defending. The sea wind cooled their armor, the harbor lights guided them home. Rome had never been this beautiful or this peaceful, but even peace carries tension. The East watched the West crumble with both sorrow and caution. Refugees arrived daily, senators, scholars, artisans, carrying stories of lost towns and silent roads. Constantinople became not just a capital, but a refuge for what remained of Roman spirit. The city's walls enclosed both hope and memory. Each evening, as lamps flickered across the harbor, the city glowed like a necklace of fire reflected on water. Sailors whispered that it was blessed by its location, protected by time itself. In truth, it was protected by discipline, the quiet work of people determined not to repeat the mistakes of history. The empire had found wisdom in restraint, and so, as night settles over the Bosporus, the old empire breathes again, transformed, quieter, wiser. Power has shifted, but not vanished. The light that once burned in Rome now burns here, refracted through 1,000 ripples of sea and history. What began as survival had become renewal. The empire was not dying, it was learning how to live differently. As decades passed, Constantinople grew into the shape that history would remember, not a city of conquest, but of resilience. The empire's new heart no longer beat for expansion, but for preservation. Its rulers understood that greatness could live in stillness. The walls they built were not only of stone, but of discipline, patience, and memory. Within those walls, the Roman spirit began to adapt to a quieter world. The city's rhythm was different from Rome's. The old capital had thrived on noise, parades, debates, the roar of crowds in arenas. Constantinople moved slower. Its mornings began with the sound of harbor bells and the call of merchants. Its nights ended with the sea's whisper against the docks. There was energy still, but it was focused less on spectacle, more on survival. A civilization that once shouted now spoke softly and endured longer. In the grand squares, statues of past emperors stood beside new ones, their faces carved with restraint rather than pride. The people still honored their history, but their admiration had changed tone. Rome had been a monument to power. Constantinople was a monument to persistence. Its strength came not from ambition, but from its ability to hold fast when the rest of the world seemed to shift. Trade routes became its lifelines. The city thrived on connection. a web of merchants carrying goods across deserts and seas. Gold from Nubia, glass from Syria, and textiles from the East met here in harmony. The markets overflowed with color, sound, and scent, yet beneath the liveliness was order. Every trade, every tax, every shipment was carefully recorded. The empire had learned that wealth without structure is as fleeting as wind. The emperors who ruled this eastern Rome learned to balance pride with humility. They built great palaces, yes, but they also built schools, libraries, and baths. The empire had grown wiser with age. It no longer needed to prove its greatness through endless conquest. Instead, it sought to outlast chaos by tending to what mattered: knowledge, safety, stability. The scholars of Constantinople became the new keepers of civilization. In quiet halls filled with candles and scrolls, they copied ancient texts, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and history. Their careful hands preserved the memory of worlds that had already crumbled. Each page they saved became a bridge between past and future. Knowledge, once scattered across empires, now found refuge within these walls. Meanwhile, artisans shaped the city's identity with patience and craft. Mosaics shimmered across ceilings, telling stories in stone and glass. Carpets woven in distant lands adorned palaces and inns alike. The empire's culture was not uniform. It was a mosaic, each piece different, yet together forming something beautiful. The East had inherited Rome's ambition but replaced its hunger with artistry. The harbor, known as the Golden Horn, never slept. Ships came and went at all hours, carrying news, spices, and ideas. It was here that the empire met the world through sailors, traders, and wanderers. Every arrival was a reminder that survival is not isolation, but connection. Constantinople's openness was its strength. The city's defenses, however, remained unmatched. Its triple walls stood like a promise against time. Armies came to test them, but few succeeded. The stones, weathered by centuries, carried the memory of countless storms. They protected more than a city. They protected the continuity of civilization itself. The empire no longer sought to conquer others, it sought to resist oblivion. In the western provinces, distant and weakened, the memory of Rome grew faint. Yet the people there spoke of Constantinople with a kind of reverence. To them, it was the last light of an old world, the city that had taken Rome's dying flame and kept it burning. Hope, they believed, had moved east. And in a sense, it had. The emperors ruled with an awareness their predecessors lacked. They had seen the cost of excess. They knew that wealth, armies, and monuments could crumble overnight, but wisdom and structure could last generations. Their vision was not of a golden empire, but a sustainable one, an empire built on balance. They understood that to survive, they must adapt, not dominate. As time went on, Constantinople became a mirror of contrasts, a city both ancient and modern, humble and magnificent. Caravans brought the pulse of Asia, while fleets carried the song of Europe. It was a crossroads of humanity, where differences did not always mean conflict. In its markets, strangers could trade, argue, and laugh without fear. That was power of a different kind, quieter, but deeper. Life for ordinary citizens reflected this calm strength. Bakers, sailors, scribes, and guards moved through their routines with quiet confidence. They did not live for empire. They lived for community. The state had learned to serve its people rather than consume them. Empires built on such care may not shine as brightly, but they endure longer and more kindly. Still, no peace is without its shadows. Ambition never truly disappears. Some rulers grew hungry for expansion again, and wars flared along the borders. Yet the empire always returned to caution. It knew what it risked by chasing glory. A city that has seen centuries pass learns patience as its greatest weapon. Constantinople had become a master of waiting. Even its beauty reflected that wisdom. The city did not flaunt its wealth, it whispered it. Its domes shone softly in sunlight, its streets paved not with gold, but with endurance. To the traveler arriving by sea, it appeared as both a dream and a memory, a place where the old world rested, not in ruin, but in renewal. Beyond the walls, the countryside thrived under this new rhythm. Farmers tilled fertile lands, artisans built villages, and merchants moved goods inland. Life felt stable, even prosperous. The East had succeeded where the West had failed, not by being stronger, but by being wiser. It had learned that lasting power is not loud, but deliberate. The empire's story was no longer one of conquest, but of stewardship. To rule meant to protect, not to expand. The rulers became caretakers of time, guarding knowledge, trade, and peace. They had learned, through centuries of hardship, that empire is fragile, and that what survives longest is often what moves slowest. As dusk fell over the Bosporus, the city shimmered like a lantern between continents. Fishermen mended their nets by the shore, scholars closed their books for the night, and the faint hum of conversation rose from taverns and courtyards. Power no longer meant fear, it meant balance. It meant balance, it meant calm. The shift was complete. Soft pause, the sea breathes softly against the harbour stones. The firelight dims, reflecting in gentle ripples. Rest now with the quiet confidence of this enduring empire. In the next story, we'll return westward to those who were left behind, and how ordinary lives carried on in the long, gentle twilight of Rome. Tonight, our story drifts back west away from the bright harbours of Constantinople and into the quieter lands that once called themselves Rome. Here, in valleys and villages scattered across fading provinces, ordinary people continued to live while history moved on without them. Their world no longer echoed with marching legions or marble speeches. It hummed with the softer rhythm of survival. The collapse of an empire rarely feels like an explosion. For those who lived through it, it felt more like a long winter settling over familiar ground. The empire's banners still fluttered in some places, but the messengers stopped coming, the tax collectors stopped returning, and decisions once made in distant halls were now made around kitchen fires. The Roman world had not ended. It had simply grown smaller, close enough to touch, fragile enough to hold. In small towns, the stone baths and theatres still stood, though moss crept up their walls and birds nested in the corners. Children played in the same streets where senators once rode in chariots. To them, these ruins were not monuments, they were playgrounds. The weight of the past had become part of the landscape, a memory absorbed into daily life. Farmers rose before dawn as they always had. They tied sandals worn thin, led oxen to the fields, and measured their days by sunlight rather than calendars. The empire that once mapped every hour now left them to the seasons. Taxes were collected by whoever had the power to demand them, sometimes a local landlord, sometimes a soldier passing through. Order had become personal, not imperial. In coastal villages, fishermen still pushed their boats into grey water. They had no interest in emperors or borders, only in weather, tides, and whether the nets would come back full. Rome's fall meant little to the sea. The horizon remained the same. The fishermen's prayers were for calm waves and fair trade. not for glory or conquest. Life had narrowed, but it was no less meaningful. Merchants adapted as they always do. The grand routes that once connected Britain to Egypt had fractured, but smaller roads still carried goods between towns. A trader with a sturdy cart and a trustworthy mule could still earn a living. Coins from forgotten emperors changed hands beside handmade pottery and sacks of grain. Value no longer came from authority, but from usefulness. In the fading cities, silence became the new normal. Streets once filled with crowds now echoed with the sound of footsteps and wind. Market stalls remained, but fewer voices called out. People still met, still bartered, still shared news, but the scale had changed. The empire's roar had become a murmur. Yet in that quiet, there was peace and end to the endless motion of politics and war. Families gathered at night around simple meals. Bread, olives, maybe a little cheese or lentils. Conversation replaced spectacle. The children heard stories not of emperors, but of ancestors, of grandparents who had seen armies march past their fields. History, once written in marble, now lived in memory and voice. The empire had left behind something even stronger than wealth: storytelling. Local leaders emerged from necessity. Without Rome's officials, towns chose their own elders to keep order, settle disputes, and oversee harvests. Power was no longer distant or divine. It was familiar, sometimes flawed, but human. The empire's collapse had forced responsibility to return to the people it once governed. In some places, soldiers who had lost their legions became protectors for hire. They guarded roads, escorted merchants, and kept bandits at bay. Their armor was dented, their loyalty uncertain, but their discipline remained. They were living reminders of a world that had once believed in order. Now they served not for empire, but for survival. The landscape itself seemed to breathe differently. Forests crept back over abandoned estates. Fields once lined with villas now lay open to wildflowers and deer. Nature, patient and forgiving, reclaimed what marble had borrowed. The empire's fall gave the earth time to heal. The sound of birds returned to courtyards that had known only the noise of human ambition. Still, not everything was loss. The aqueducts continued to carry water for generations. The roads, though cracked, remained the best paths through the land. The knowledge of how to build, how to farm, how to write did not vanish. It lingered, carried quietly by those who refused to forget. Civilization had not disappeared, had simply gone local. Among the ruins, small acts of kindness stitched communities together. Neighbors shared tools, mended each other's roofs, cared for the old and sick. The empire's power had once come from armies. Now it came from empathy. Humanity filled the spaces where laws had once ruled. People no longer looked to distant capitals for justice, they found it in each other. For those who remembered the old days, the change felt bittersweet. They missed the certainty of the empire, the sense that someone, somewhere, was in control. But they also cherished the freedom that came with being forgotten. The taxes were lighter, the rules fewer. In the absence of empire, life found room to breathe. Travelers passing through described strange new rulers rising in distant lands, kings, warlords, tribes claiming old territories. The people listened politely, then returned to their work. The world beyond their horizon had always been unpredictable. What mattered was the next harvest, the next meal, the next morning. History continued, but at a slower, more human pace. In quiet monasteries, scribes continued their work, copying old books, preserving records, keeping memory alive. They were the gardeners of knowledge, tending to words instead of plants. Through their hands, the wisdom of centuries crossed safely into the future. Empires fall, but ideas, once written, can outlast stone. As dusk fell each evening, smoke rose from cottage chimneys. The sky glowed with the same orange hue that had once lit Rome's palaces. Time had changed everything except the simple rhythm of life, the comfort of firelight, the murmur of voices, the closing of another day. The people left behind were not relics. They were continuity itself. If you were to walk through those lands, then you would not see despair. You would see resilience, people making do with less, shaping new worlds from old ruins. History often celebrates power, but it is endurance that sustains it. The people of the post-Roman world understood this truth in their bones. As generations passed, the memories of the old empire softened. What had once been Rome's authority became legend, and what had been legend became folklore. The people told stories of a time when roads never broke, when justice arrived with the stamp of a seal, when gold flowed from the east. These tales were not nostalgia alone, they were comfort, a reminder that life had once been stable and might be again someday. Children who grew up among ruins never called them ruins. To them, the broken arches and toppled columns were simply part of the world. They climbed them, played in their shadows, and carved their own names into the same stones that once bore the marks of emperors. The empire's monuments had lost their grandeur, but gained something gentler, familiarity. They had become part of childhood, part of home. The language, too, began to change. Latin, once precise and commanding, softened into local dialects. Each region spoke its own version, colored by new sounds, new words, and new needs. Scholars later called it transformation. But for those living through it, it was just communication, practical, evolving, alive. The empire had tried to impose one voice upon the world. The world had quietly answered back, with many. Trade survived in new forms. Instead of grand caravans and merchant fleets, smaller markets sprouted in villages and crossroads. People exchanged what they could make with what they needed. Honey for cloth, wool for salt, bread for oil. The empire's economy had once been vast and abstract. Now it was personal, built on trust and repetition. A handshake meant more than a coin stamped with a forgotten emperor's face. The craftsman adapted fastest. Without imperial contracts for statues and temples, they turned to practical work, furniture, tools, pottery, millstones. Their artistry became humbler but more intimate, meant for hands rather than palaces. In that simplicity, craftsmanship flourished again. When art serves survival, it becomes timeless. In some towns, old Roman villas were turned into shared homes. Families built walls within walls, dividing grand halls into smaller rooms. Where once nobles feasted, children now played. Where marble floors once gleamed, fires now burned for warmth. It was a quiet transformation, opulence melting into ordinary life. The empire's architecture did not disappear. It adapted, just as its people did. Knowledge, however, remained a fragile treasure. Teachers continued to pass on what they could: mathematics, farming techniques, bits of history half remembered from their own mentors. Books grew rare, but wisdom moved mouth to mouth, preserved by repetition. The great libraries were gone, but the desire to understand remained unbroken. The roads, though cracked and overgrown, were still the lifelines of the land. Travelers followed their traces, the smooth stones buried under weeds, the milestones half hidden in soil. They were paths made by hands that believed in eternity. Even when those hands were gone, the paths endured, guiding new feet across the same earth. In quiet chapels and homes, families gathered at dusk to share stories. Some were memories, others invention, but all were wrapped in the same warmth, the human need to belong. Without the Empire's festivals, people made their own. Harvest feasts, spring gatherings, markets that doubled as reunions. Celebration found its way back to simplicity. The rhythm of life slowed, but it became more peaceful. No armies marched, no decrees arrived from distant rulers. The people lived by the turning of seasons and the kindness of neighbors. It was not grandeur, but it was stability, the kind that grows roots rather than towers. The world had grown smaller, but its heart had grown stronger. Sometimes, travelers from the east passed through, merchants from Constantinople, scholars from faraway lands. They spoke of a world still ruled by emperors, of cities filled with gold and glass. The villagers listened politely, smiled, and returned to their fields. They had no envy, only contentment. The Empire's shadow no longer frightened them. They had found peace in its absence. The old symbols of power faded quietly. The eagles carved into gates, the Latin inscriptions on walls, the coins with unfamiliar faces, all became decorations rather than declarations. The Empire had once ruled through fear and admiration. Now, its remnants lived as reminders, silent, harmless, and strangely beautiful. Even nature seemed to protect what was left. Vines grew gently over statues, softening their edges. Moss covered crumbling mosaics with green velvet. The wind carried the scent of rain through broken roofs, and the sound of birds filled old amphitheaters. The Empire's ruins had become gardens. The world had taken back what was borrowed, kindly. In the villages, leadership changed hands, not by lineage, but by respect. Those who worked hardest, who knew how to fix, to farm, to heal, they became the new guides. Authority was earned, not inherited. The age of empire had ended. The age of community had begun. Old habits of order still lingered. People counted time by Roman months, measured fields in Roman units, built walls with Roman tools. The empire's ghost lived on in practicality. History does not vanish when power fades. It simply hides in the details of daily life. Generations later, children would ask their elders what Rome truly was. Some would point to the roads, others to the language, the law, the stories. None of them were wrong, for the empire had become not a place, but a memory carried in ordinary hearts. Its survival was not in marble or gold, but in the human instinct to continue. If you could stand among them then, you might see no empire at all, only quiet villages, smoke rising from hearths, and laughter echoing across fields. But beneath that quiet lay the endurance of centuries, the invisible strength of people who refused to vanish. History, at its gentlest, is written by those who keep going. And so, the people left behind became the bridge between worlds, between empire and aftermath, between glory and grace. They taught the future how to rebuild not with conquest, but with patience. Their gift to time was continuity, wrapped in simplicity. Soft pause, the fire hums low now. The night settles over forgotten roads. Rest here among the people who never stopped living, even when the world they knew dissolved around them. In the next story, we'll listen to the silence of the West, when the city of Rome itself finally bowed to history's tide. Tonight, we return to the city that began it all, to Rome herself, no longer the heart of empire, but a quiet shadow of her former self. The marble still stands, the streets still wind as they always did, yet the voices that once filled them have grown faint, This is not a story of destruction. It is a story of stillness, of how a city learns to breathe again after centuries of noise. The Rome of this age was a place of echoes. Every stone carried memory. The steps of old temples, the pillars of long-emptied forums, the arches leading nowhere, all whispered of greatness that once felt eternal. But time had softened their sharp edges. Weeds grew through cracks in the marble. Birds nested in the corners of statues. The city was no longer a command, it was a sigh. The people who lived here no longer thought of empire. They thought of survival. Bakers still kneaded dough before dawn. Blacksmiths still struck iron. Children still played among broken columns. Life had not left Rome. It had simply changed its rhythm. The world had moved on, and Rome, once impatient, had learned patience. The grand palaces stood empty or divided into smaller homes. Mosaic floors that once felt the sandals of senators now bore the footprints of families. The great halls that once echoed with politics now rang with laughter or with the quiet hum of daily life. What had been opulent was now ordinary, and in that ordinariness, strangely peaceful. The Forum, once the beating heart of public life, had grown still. Grass sprouted where crowds once gathered. Market stalls still appeared each morning, but fewer voices called out. A few merchants sold oil, grain, or wool. A few buyers wandered through. The same sun shone on the ruins as it always had, but its light fell differently, softer, kinder, as if reluctant to intrude. The fountains still trickled, though some ran dry. The aqueducts that once carried water from distant hills were crumbling, yet enough remained to fill jars and basins. The people learned to patch and repair what they could, taking pride not in new creations, but in preservation. The art of survival had replaced the art of conquest. At night, the city grew quiet early. The streets that once glowed with torches and laughter now dimmed after sunset. The few travelers who passed through spoke of Rome as a dream, a place once unstoppable, now still. But to those who lived here, the stillness felt natural, like a long exhale after centuries of strain. The amphitheaters stood in silence. Where cheers once thundered, only wind moved through the arches. Some parts had been repurposed, stones taken to build homes, arches turned into stables. The Colosseum itself was both ruin and refuge. Nature and humanity had found a strange peace within its old bones. The senators who remained in the city no longer argued over laws. Their debates had faded into memory. Some had become teachers, passing down history to children who listened wide-eyed to stories of emperors and triumphs. The empire's legacy survived not through power, but through storytelling. Memory was the new form of governance. The Tiber River still wound its way through the city, carrying both water and time. Its surface reflected the same moon that had watched over Rome's rise. Along its banks, fishermen cast lines where generals once marched. The sound of oars, once lost among the shouts of the crowd, was now the loudest thing in the night. Merchants still arrived from nearby towns, bringing modest goods, olives, cloth, pottery. Trade had shrunk but endured. The city no longer dealt in silver or silk, it traded in usefulness. Rome had once measured wealth by empire. Now it measured wealth by sufficiency. Enough was plenty. In some corners, ivy covered entire walls. What had once been marble now appeared soft, wrapped in green. It was as if nature had gently tucked the city beneath a blanket, not to erase her, but to let her rest. The silent courtyard of the empire had become a garden of memory. Among the ruins, you could still find inscriptions carved long ago, words of victory, names of rulers, boasts of eternity. The letters had faded, but not vanished. Each groove held the persistence of human hands, the same hands that built, hoped, and aged. Even decay can be beautiful when it carries the trace of effort. The city's markets no longer competed with those of Constantinople. Rome had become provincial, quieter, smaller, but in that humility was peace. The people no longer dreamed of conquering. They dreamed of harvests, of rain, of safety. Ambition had softened into gratitude. Each evening, lamps flickered in the windows of old houses. The smell of baked bread drifted through narrow alleys. Cats curled among fallen stones, and somewhere a lute played softly. The city was no longer performing for the world. She was simply living for herself. The few travelers who passed through were often scholars or pilgrims, drawn by curiosity rather than duty. They walked her streets in awe, not of power, but of endurance. Rome had survived its own glory. Few cities in history have ever done that. Sometimes earthquakes shook the old walls, and pieces fell away. Yet, each time, the people rebuilt, not grandly, but carefully. A beam replaced, a wall supported, a crack sealed. The city's greatness no longer came from her monuments, but from the hands that refused to abandon them. The seasons gave rhythm to life once more. Spring brought green to the hills, summer filled the markets, autumn turned the stones warm with afternoon light, and winter carried the smell of smoke and comfort. The empire had taught people to fear change. Now they found peace in its return. If you stood in one of the old courtyards at dusk, you would hear nothing of empire, only footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the creak of wood. The silence was not emptiness, it was balance. The city was no longer a command to the world. It was a whisper to itself. As the years drifted on, the people of Rome grew used to the quiet. The noise of empire had faded into memory, replaced by the rhythm of ordinary sounds, footsteps on stone, the turning of mill wheels, the laughter of children echoing through narrow lanes. There was comfort in this gentleness. The city had traded command for calm. Its glory had turned inward, becoming something personal, something human. The great temples, once filled with ceremony, had become landmarks of curiosity. Travelers sometimes wandered in to rest in their shade, admiring the artistry of ages long gone. The columns still stood, weathered but steadfast. The carvings on their surfaces had softened with time, like faces wrinkled by wisdom. The temples no longer demanded worship. They simply existed, reminders of a time when people thought the world could be shaped by will alone. The city's scholars, fewer now but devoted, gathered in old villas to teach what knowledge they could. They spoke of geometry, astronomy, poetry, the remnants of Rome's learning passed down through centuries. Their students copied the words carefully on parchment, knowing that every sentence might be the last bridge to an older world. In quiet rooms, lit by flickering oil lamps, the Roman mind continued to breathe. Outside, craftsmen shaped their future with steady hands. Masons repaired broken fountains, carpenters built sturdy shutters, potters spun clay into vessels that would outlast their names. The artistry of survival had replaced the architecture of empire. What once was a city of monuments was now a city of makers. Each act of repair was a form of hope, a belief that even in decline, beauty still mattered. The Tiber continued to flow, steady and patient. Its surface reflected the past and carried it onward, out to sea. Barges moved slowly now, their cargo humble grain, firewood, clay. The river no longer mirrored the might of empire, but the quiet persistence of people who refused to leave. Rome's endurance was no longer measured in armies, but in the gentle persistence of daily labor. When the rains came, the old stones glistened. The water ran through cracks in marble, through the same streets once swept by emperors' processions. The sound of rain on stone was like a song the city had always known, older than empire, older than memory. Even as roofs leaked and walls crumbled, the rhythm of nature folded softly into the rhythm of human life. In some seasons, travelers from faraway lands passed through the city, curious about the ruins of what had been the world's center. They expected silence and emptiness, but they found life, small fires burning in courtyards, bread baking in shared ovens, laughter echoing through old markets. Rome was not dead, she was living differently. History had slowed, but it had not stopped. Each morning, smoke rose from hearths, and the scent of baked bread drifted through the air. Merchants still set up their stalls near the ruins of the Forum. A few coins still changed hands. The economy of empire had long vanished, but the economy of need and kindness remained. The city's people had learned to live without promises of greatness. They were content with enough. For those who remembered the days of might, the new Rome seemed smaller, but it was gentler too. There were no parades of victory, no endless taxes for distant wars, no commands shouted from marble steps. Life belonged once again to those who lived it. In the emptiness of empire, people had rediscovered ownership of their days. As dusk fell, families gathered around small fires in courtyards once meant for banquets. They told stories of ancestors, of the city's founding, of the time when the world had listened to Rome. The children listened wide-eyed, imagining streets filled with golden light, unaware that they were sitting in the same courtyards those ancestors had walked. Time had folded itself neatly into memory. The night air in the city was gentle. Crickets sang where once soldiers had marched. The moonlight turned the ruins silver, softening every harsh line. From a distance, it was hard to tell whether the city was sleeping or dreaming. Perhaps it was both, resting between centuries, neither gone nor awake, suspended in the stillness of its own endurance. Some houses stood half-collapsed, their upper floors open to the sky, and yet people still lived inside, turning broken walls into gardens. They planted herbs where marble once gleamed, hung laundry where curtains had once been silk. The empire's end had not erased them, it had taught them adaptation. The smallest homes now carried the weight of resilience, once held by palaces. In these streets, friendship replaced politics. The neighbor became more important than the ruler. Communities formed naturally, bonded by need rather than decree. The power that once flowed from the emperor's hand now flowed from compassion. It was quieter, invisible, but stronger than any law. The seasons marked time more faithfully than calendars now. Each year was measured not by decrees, but by harvests, by rain, by the slow return of swallows in spring. Nature had always been patient, waiting beneath the empire's ambition. Now, at last, the earth and the city shared the same calm rhythm. Somewhere in the city, a teacher might have said to a child, once, "All roads led here," and the child, curious, might have asked, "Where do they lead now?" The teacher would smile softly and answer, "Everywhere," for the spirit of Rome had scattered like seeds, no longer contained by walls, but carried by people. The statues, chipped and weathered, stood as companions rather than idols. The people passed them daily, offering no reverence, yet feeling comfort in their presence. They were reminders of endurance, that even when purpose fades, form remains, and beauty can survive beyond meaning. Rome no longer belonged to emperors or armies. It belonged to those who stayed, the bakers, the potters, the teachers, the children. The city had been reborn in their hands, smaller, humbler, but alive. Empires end, but life, guided by the will of the Almighty, continues in all its quiet glory. If you walked those streets at dawn, you might hear the sound of a broom sweeping dust from the stones, or the murmur of someone humming while drawing water from a well. It was a different Rome, yet the same, still enduring, still breathing, still itself. The city had traded conquest for contentment. And so, the silent courtyard stood no longer the stage of history, but the sanctuary of humanity. What Rome lost in power, it gained in peace. The empire's heart had stopped beating, but its soul was still awake, listening to the soft echo of time passing through its arches. Soft pause, the embers glow faintly now, reflecting off ancient stone. Rest here with the city that has outlived its own story. In the next chapter, we'll listen to the echoes within its towers, where memory lingers and history learns to whisper. Tonight, we climb quietly to the high places, the lonely towers that still watch over the sleeping city. They have stood through rain and ruin, through triumph and forgetting. From their height, the world seems unchanged, yet everything beneath them has shifted. This is their story, not of defense, but of memory, the calm recollection of stone. Each tower once had a purpose. They signaled danger, guarded gates, and marked the borders of empire. Now they simply stand, grey against the slow sky. Their stones no longer ring with orders or shields, only with wind. Birds nest in their corners, ivy drapes their windows. The towers have become keepers of silence, witnesses to centuries of patience. At dawn, light crawls up their walls, revealing cracks that trace the years like wrinkles on an old face. The towers do not mind. They were never built for eternity. They were built to endure as long as hands cared for them. The hands are gone, but the purpose remains steadfast, simple, uncomplaining. When storms roll in from the sea, thunder echoes through their hollows. The rain slides down their sides, polishing dust from carvings no one can read. From below, villagers see the flashes of lightning around the spires and whisper that the towers are remembering their voices awakening. For a moment before the calm returns, in the quiet after rain, the towers gleam. The air smells of stone and wet earth. From their windows, you can see the patchwork of fields stretching beyond the old city. Where once legions marched, sheep now graze. The rhythm of conquest has turned into the rhythm of harvest. The towers have watched it all, unmoving, forgiving. Inside, stairways spiral upward into shadow. Dust drifts through slanted light like tiny ghosts of those who once stood guard. A few carvings remain on the walls, names, dates, a message, perhaps, of love or duty. These are the true archives of the empire, simple marks of human presence, fading but sincere. Sometimes children from nearby homes dare to explore. Their laughter echoes where once the clang of armor rang. They find broken helmets, rusted hinges, bits of pottery, and call them treasures. The towers, if they could feel, might be glad remembering not war, but wonder. From their heights, the city below looks peaceful. The courtyards shimmer with evening smoke. The Tiber glints like a thread of silver. Rome, once loud, now hums like a lullaby. The towers look down on this gentler life and seem to breathe easier. Their long watch has become a meditation. As years pass, one tower leans slightly but never falls. Another loses its roof but keeps its walls. They accept decay the way trees accept winter without complaint. To endure is not to resist change, but to let it pass through you. The towers know this better than anyone. At night, owls perch on their ledges, calling softly to one another. The moonlight paints their stones white, erasing time. To look upon them then is to see every century layered in silence, the rise, the fall, and the peace that followed. The towers are not ruins. They are memory made solid. When travelers approach from distant lands, they see the towers first. Their shapes rise from the hills like old sentinels greeting newcomers. The travelers whisper that these must be watchtowers of the ancient empire, still keeping vigil. And in a way, they are right. The towers have forgotten command, but not purpose. In the markets, people tell stories about them. Some say the towers can hear prayers carried by the wind. Others believe that when they dream, they see the world as it once was, roads busy with carts, harbors full of sails, voices raised in unity. Whether true or not, the belief itself is comforting. It gives the old stones a heartbeat. The tower's shadows stretch long at sunset, touching fields and gardens. Children chase them playfully, unaware that they are running through centuries of history. The past has become part of the landscape, gentle and familiar. In this way, the towers live on not as monuments, but as neighbors. Every spring, ivy climbs higher, covering another foot of wall. The greenery softens their shape until they look like pieces of the earth itself. Nature, once held back by stone, now embraces it. The towers, patient and proud, accept the company. They have learned that survival sometimes means surrendering to beauty. Inside one tower, a single bell still hangs. Its rope is frayed, its sound faint, but on windy days it rings without a hand to guide it. The tone drifts over the rooftops like a sigh, soft, uncertain, familiar. People pause when they hear it, unsure whether it's real or memory. As darkness deepens, the city lights flicker below like fireflies. The towers watch over them quietly. They no longer guard power or empire, only peace. They are monuments to endurance, to the truth that stillness can outlast movement, and silence can outlive command. The wind rises again before midnight, brushing across the old stones. It carries dust, voices, and the faint scent of rain. The towers seem to listen, as if recognizing friends long gone. Their watch never ends, but it no longer feels heavy. It feels like belonging. If you touch their walls, you feel warmth where the sun lingered. The stone holds memory the way the mind holds dreams, gently, imperfectly, but faithfully. These towers have seen the world change 100 times, yet they remain steady, content to witness rather than lead. And so, under the wide sky, the towers remember not in words or thoughts, but in presence. They remind us that what stands quietly can speak across ages. Rome may have fallen, but its towers still stand, whispering through wind and time. Endurance is its own victory. As centuries drifted on, the towers no longer counted years. They simply existed within them. Seasons wrapped around their stones like waves around a rock. Winter brought frost that traced white lace across the walls. Summer filled the air with the hum of insects and the scent of grass. The towers did not change, but everything else did: the people, the language, the very rhythm of life below. Yet still, they stood, watching with patient indifference. New generations grew up never knowing the empire that built these heights. To them, the towers were not relics of power, but landmarks of belonging. Lovers met beneath them, shepherds used them to mark distance, and travelers prayed for their glimpse after long journeys home. The towers had shed their armor and become part of the landscape's heart, no longer symbols of authority, but of continuity. On quiet evenings, when the wind came down from the hills, the towers seemed almost to hum. The air passing through their hollow arches created low, haunting tones, music not made by hands but by history itself. Villagers called it the breathing of the stone. They said the towers exhaled the memories they could no longer hold, releasing them gently into the night. The land around them changed shape. Forests spread where farms once were, rivers shifted their courses, roads crumbled into winding paths lined with wildflowers. The empire's geometry had softened into nature's curves, yet the towers, stubborn in grace, remained. Their outlines at dusk were the punctuation marks of a forgotten sentence, still legible to the attentive eye. Sometimes, storms tore pieces from them, chunks of stone, sections of parapet. But each time, people returned to patch what they could. No emperor commanded it, no reward was given. The act itself was enough. To repair a tower was to repair memory, to say, we remember what built us, even if we no longer rule. Within their chambers, swallows built nests of mud and straw. The flutter of wings replaced the clang of armor. New life thrived where vigilance once lived. The towers had not become empty, they had become homes for creatures without history. Proof that purpose always finds those who need shelter. From their heights, one could see new villages forming along the horizon. Smoke rose from hearths, faint against the twilight. The world that followed Rome was smaller, humbler, but alive in a way that empire had never been. The towers watched this world with quiet approval, guardians not of conquest, but of renewal. In winter, snow gathered along their ledges, muting even the sound of the wind. The city below slept deeply. Sometimes, the moon cast silver over the roofs, and the towers gleamed like ghosts of light. They had become part of the sky-silent silhouettes bridging heaven and earth. Patient witnesses to the slow forgiveness of time. Each spring, vines climbed higher, filling cracks with green veins. The union of plant and stone was seamless, now one breathing, one remembering. The people saw it as a blessing, the earth reclaiming its children. The towers, half ruin, half garden, showed that beauty does not always fade. Sometimes it merely changes texture. One tower near the river leaned slightly more each year, as if listening. People began calling it the tower that bows. They said it bent its ear to the stories told below, of marriages, of harvests, of new births. In its tilt, they saw kindness. What had once been a sign of decay became a gesture of affection, a symbol that even stone could learn humility. When travelers from distant lands arrived, they brought new languages and new maps. They looked upon the towers and saw mystery. Some thought they were tombs, others fortresses of gods long forgotten. The locals simply smiled. To them, the towers needed no explanation. They were as ordinary and sacred as the hills themselves. At dusk, children gathered near the base to watch the last light climb the walls. They told tales that the towers stored sunlight within their stones, releasing it slowly to warm the nights. It was not true, but it felt true, and sometimes belief is another form of memory. The towers glowed faintly in their imagination, eternal because children kept them alive in stories. In the quiet hours before dawn, mist rose from the river and wrapped the towers in soft white. They seemed to vanish, then reappear, like thoughts half remembered. The city awoke beneath them, stretching into another day. Markets opened, bread baked, laughter returned. The towers remained still, unneeded but unforgotten. Some evenings, an old man or woman might sit at the tower's base, speaking softly as if to a friend. They would tell the tower their worries, their small joys. The stone, unresponsive but solid, offered the comfort of listening. It had listened for centuries. It would listen for centuries more. The people had learned to see the towers not as reminders of loss, but as teachers of patience. Nothing lasts forever, the towers whispered, but everything leaves something behind, an imprint, a lesson, a shadow that shapes what follows. The empire's towers had become philosophers in stone. As twilight deepened, torches flickered in the streets, casting moving light up the old walls. Shadows danced across carvings of faded eagles and forgotten words. The city and its towers seemed to breathe together, alive in their shared quiet. The bond between ruin and life was complete. When rain returned, the droplets sang softly against the stones, each impact a note in a melody older than history. The sound lulled the city to rest. The towers absorbed it, all the rain, the whispers, the passing of footsteps. Sand held it in their unspoken memory, and so, through centuries of silence, they endured, not as symbols of authority, but of acceptance. Their strength was not in resisting time, but in allowing time to shape them. The towers had become the heartbeat of peace, steady, low, unbroken. If you were to stand before one now, hand against the cool stone, you might feel it a faint hum beneath your palm, as if the world itself were breathing through the walls. That is history, alive and kind, reminding you that every ending is also a continuation. Soft pause, the night folds gently around the towers. Rest here in their shadow, where time stands still but peace moves freely. In the next chapter, we'll follow the whisper that drifts beyond these walls into the quiet dawn, where memory meets morning. Tonight, our journey nears its end. The fire burns low, and the air feels older, as if history itself is settling in for rest. The towers behind us stand calm against the sky, their shadows long and familiar. We have followed Rome through rise and silence, through noise and gentleness, and here, in the hush of its twilight, we listen to what remains, the breath of endurance. The empire that once claimed the world now exists only in fragments, in words, in stones, in the memories of those who came after. Yet somehow, its echo still feels alive. Perhaps because the story of Rome was never just about power. It was about people, the builders, the dreamers, the ones who stayed when glory left. And even now, their story continues to murmur beneath the wind. The ruins do not mourn. They do not regret. They simply are. Their stillness holds acceptance, not sorrow. Each arch and column is a sentence left unfinished, a reminder that every civilization pauses before it disappears. The stones are content in their purpose, to stand, to shelter, to remind. They no longer need to shout of greatness. Their silence is enough. In the mornings, sunlight still brushes over the old marble. Birds perch where banners once hung. The air carries no orders, only warmth. Time has not erased Rome, it has refined it. The city that once sought to rule everything has found its truest strength, the grace to let go. If you listen closely, you might still hear the echo of footsteps, merchants crossing bridges, children laughing in the streets, the faint clang of a distant forge. These are not ghosts, they are continuity. Rome's pulse did not stop. It slowed, softened, and merged with the world around it. Far beyond the ruins, the seeds of its memory took root. Languages evolved from Latin. Roads became the foundations of new cities. The order that once spread by law now spread by habit. The world carried Rome not as an empire, but as a pattern, a quiet inheritance of structure, curiosity, and endurance. The towers, the courtyards, the broken statues, they stand not as reminders of what was lost, but of what was learned. That power fades, but creation lasts. That pride crumbles, but kindness endures. That no structure, no matter how mighty, can outlast the will of the Almighty, who allows all things to rise and fall in their appointed time. The night settles deeper. A soft wind moves through the ruins, brushing against stone and memory. You can almost imagine the towers exhaling, as if relieved to see the world still alive beneath them. For all their centuries of watchfulness, they have seen one truth repeated: life always returns. In the small gardens where once stood palaces, flowers bloom through cracks in the pavement. The bees hum where once senators argued. The world, with infinite patience, turns even the remnants of ambition into nourishment. It is a gentle reminder that history, when left to rest, feeds the earth it once ruled. Travelers who come here now do not bow to statues or seek fortune. They walk quietly, touching the stones as one might greet an old friend. They take nothing except the calm that lingers here, the peace of knowing that time is both destroyer and healer. Rome's legacy, in truth, is not dominance, but endurance. Each sunset paints the ruins gold for a few fleeting minutes, as if the city briefly remembers its former light. Then the glow fades, and the stones return to shadow. But even in darkness, they hold warmth from the day, proof that what once shone brightly can still carry its light inward. Long after the world has moved on, in the tower's silence, there is wisdom. They remind us that no sound lasts forever, no empire remains unbroken, and yet nothing is truly lost. Every age leaves behind a shape, a word, a kindness. The towers remember not through sight or sound, but through patience, the greatest strength of all. If you stand at their base and close your eyes, you might feel the faint hum of time itself. The air carries the scent of dust, of rain, of stories too old to name. You realize then that the city beneath your feet is still breathing, quietly, humbly, just as it always has. The people who live here now walk among ruins without fear. To them, the past is not a shadow, but a companion. They use the old stones to build new homes, turning memory into foundation. The empire's fall gave them space to live differently, to rebuild without pressure, to thrive without spectacle. And so, the story of Rome does not end with fire or defeat. It ends with calm, with the steady passing of generations who learned to plant where others conquered, with the quiet courage of people who carried on when the banners fell. That is how empires truly survive, not through conquest, but through continuity. The moon rises over the city now, washing the stones in silver. It is the same moon the soldiers once saw, the same light that glowed on the helmets of emperors. Time has changed everything beneath it, yet the sky has remained mercifully constant, a reminder that the world, in all its movement, is still held within order and design. From the highest tower, the view remains endless. Beyond the hills lie new nations, new languages, new hearts, carrying fragments of what Rome once was. The empire has dissolved into the fabric of the world unseen, but present, like threads of gold woven into simple cloth. The towers stand as punctuation marks to the long story of human ambition, a pause at the end of a sentence written in stone, not an ending, but a reflection, the kind of silence that teaches rather than mourns. They have seen everything, and they ask for nothing. That is their peace. And as the last embers of the fire fade, the city and its watchers blend into the night. Rome rests now, not in defeat, but in understanding. It has become part of the earth, part of memory, part of every breath that still carries its name. The night deepens over the ruins. The air cools, carrying with it the soft scent of dust and rain. Somewhere, an owl calls from the edge of the hills, its cry fading into the dark. The towers stand still, half shadow, half memory. They have learned the language of time, a language without words, spoken only through patience. In that silence, the past and present seem to meet. The world that once belonged to emperors now belongs to travelers, to storytellers, to those who listen. The marble that once echoed with commands now glows under moonlight, untouched, peaceful. The empire's strength has dissolved into something gentler, the quiet dignity of endurance. Beneath the same sky, the city dreams, not of conquest or glory, but of continuity, the endless rhythm of living things carrying on. The gardens grow wild among the broken walls, and water still flows through the old channels. Even here, in a place built for eternity, life has learned the beauty of impermanence. If the towers could speak, they might not tell of emperors or battles. They might speak instead of mornings, of the sound of merchants opening shutters, of laughter echoing across courtyards, of a mother calling her children home. History, at its heart, is not the story of power, but of presence. The stars wheel slowly overhead. They have seen everything. The first torch lit in Rome, the first wall built, the first word of a new language whispered where Latin once reigned. The stars have watched kingdoms rise, crumble, and fade, and they remain, bright and patient, as if to remind us that endurance is not only for stone, but for spirit. Far below, the Tiber reflects their light like a thread of glass. It carries the story forward, as rivers always do, taking fragments of empire to new lands, carrying whispers of history to those who have never seen its source. The river does not judge, it remembers and moves on. Each era that followed left its mark here, a carving, a wall, a name scratched into stone. The city became a tapestry of time, woven from both ruin and renewal. Nothing was erased. Everything was layered, like voices in a long, unbroken prayer for peace. The people who now walk Rome's streets may not think of the empire often, but they live within its rhythm. The layout of the roads, the curve of the bridges, the whisper of the language that has survived in new forms. Rome's story is no longer one of dominance, but of diffusion. Its light was never extinguished. It simply spread, and so, as we stand within the shadow of these towers, we understand no civilization truly ends. It transforms. The empire that ruled through command now teaches through memory. Its final lesson is quiet but profound, that all greatness must eventually become gentleness to endure. The wind shifts again, carrying the faintest echo, perhaps the ring of a forgotten bell, or the sigh of time itself. The city listens, the towers hum softly, and the night folds in around them. What remains is not sorrow, but serenity. The world continues, and history keeps its calm vigil. Tomorrow, the sun will rise on these same stones, turning them gold once more. Travelers will walk past, unaware of all they carry beneath their feet. Life, unbothered by legacy, will go on baking bread, opening shutters, lighting fires. The story will repeat itself in smaller, quieter ways. And somewhere, perhaps, another tower will be built, not in Rome, but in another world, another time, a symbol of humanity's endless need to reach upward, to leave something behind. The builders will not think of empire. They will think of shelter, of safety, of light. And that will be enough. So let the towers rest now, their stones heavy with memory. Let the night embrace them gently. They have watched the rise and fall of power, the passing of language, the quiet persistence of kindness. They have done their duty, and, like the empire they once guarded, they now belong to peace. The embers of our fire fade to soft red. The story we have followed from the empire's golden dawn to its silver dusk settles into stillness. The lesson it leaves behind is simple. What is built by hands may crumble, but what is built by hearts endures in ways unseen. The ruins breathe quietly, as if asleep, and perhaps that is all history ever is, a long sleep filled with dreams that shape the living. The stones do not mourn what is gone. They wait for the next sunrise, for the next sound of footsteps to pass by. They wait because time always returns. Now, as you rest, imagine the city not as it was, but as it is, soft with moss, golden in light, alive with quiet. The towers remember for us, so we don't have to hold it all. We can simply listen, breathe, and let the past drift like dust into peace. The firelight dims completely now. Only the faint outline of the towers remains, rising like thoughts against the starlit sky. They do not speak, but they do not need to. They have said all they ever could, by standing, by surviving, by letting go. Soft pause, closing narration. Thank you for staying until the end of this long and quiet story. If you've enjoyed this gentle journey through history, I invite you to subscribe and return next time. There's always another forgotten story waiting for you. In our next tale, we'll ask a question whispered through medieval nights. Did medieval people fear being buried alive,